Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
All right, so this is our last episode for security licensing with Microsoft, and we are actually going to talk through some listener questions and some more difficult and nuanced situations, because not everyone falls into the let's just license everyone for one thing. And so one of the questions that came in actually just this morning or maybe a day ago through LinkedIn was this listener wanted to talk about when they look at the licensing view in their admin portal, they see some device licensing rather than user licensing. And so the question was, shouldn't a licensed user for E5 be able to use up to 5 devices? And so this kind of gets into that device-based licensing versus user-based licensing. And I'm going to kick it over to Adam in a minute here, but there are situations where device-based licensing makes sense. And we do still have several solutions that you can get through device-based licensing. But what I wanted to mention is there is policy that you technically, for a user that's assigned an M365 application, so this is M365 apps, you can install the M365 apps like Word, Teams, and whatnot on 5 computers, 5 PCs, 5 tablets, and 5 mobile devices. It's usually not something that we talk about that often, but technically it's 5 plus 5 plus 5 is how we refer to it. And it's very rare that any user or any organization would exceed that limit, unless you're like an IT person and maybe you've signed into a bunch of different apps. So there is that standard. And as far as I know, there are no technical limitations or like technical enforcements that happen if you go over that. And so like how Microsoft kind of looks at it is like, if you have 5,000 users that are licensed for E5 and like 10 of them are using like 6 or 7 PCs or something like that because they're part of the IT department, it's like, okay, you know, like, as long as not like every single person has signed into like, 7, 10 devices, then it should be fine. So that's kind of how we look at it. It's just not something that comes up that often, but yeah, there technically is a policy, kind of like soft guidance, if you will, that it's 5 plus 5 plus 5. So if you want to kind of talk about the device-based licensing now, Adam, just kind of where it might make sense that you've run into, what kind of licenses that you still can get for device-based licensing, and why organizations may consider that as a path to go down versus user-based.
Sure. So Andy, what he just covered was what's referred to today as the Microsoft 365 apps for enterprise, what we used to call Office apps. So that's Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook, Teams, OneNote, so on and so forth. And he mentioned that guidance is 5 PCs or Macs. By the way, PCs or Macs are used interchangeably, 5 tablets, 5 mobile devices, a total of 15 per user. And Andy also kind of mentioned, we don't think there's any technical enforcement of that today. If you remember back to kind of the earlier days of Microsoft's enterprise business, a lot of what Microsoft didn't have any technical enforcement. You could install SQL Server on 900 different servers. You were just going to need to pay for those at your next true up. And make that whole, or sometimes there were not so great scenarios where customers didn't do that. But generally, it wasn't that it would break or you had to do anything else. It was more or less on the customers want to be compliant with their licensing and they're going to do the right thing. And so we don't need to enforce this through software-based means. There's a lot of services where that still applies. And we believe this is one of them, where as long as you're not trying to buy one license and share it amongst multiple PCs to kind of skirt licensing costs, if it's a genuine scenario of this user is using this many, this user is using less, this one's using more, but they're all within the spirit of these are Andy's devices, these are Jane's devices, you're probably in good shape. This is much more about intent and doing the right thing of these devices are only used by this one user, again, the guidance is 5 + 5 + 5. So keep that in mind. Now, Andy, you wanted to talk about other device-based licenses, and there are a couple of them we do today from a Microsoft 365 side in particular. So when you look at things like Microsoft Intune, you can either license users and then all of their devices can be enrolled in Intune, or you can license a device. So the rule of thumb is whenever you have a device, if it's a device assigned to a single user, then obviously either the user or the device needs a license. If you have a shared device, say a kiosk device, a device that sits in a public facing area of your company, either every user who would encounter or work with that device needs to have an Intune license, a user-based license, or if they don't, then your best method is to do a device-based license. So device-based licensing usually makes sense when it's not economically feasible to license every potential user. So on the flip side, if you have a PC in your break room and the only people who would ever access that PC already have a user-based license, you probably don't need to buy another license for that device because all the users who would encounter it are already licensed, and that would then cover that device. So Intune has a device-based license. Defender for Endpoint has a device-based license. Defender for Endpoint Server is an example of a device-based license where servers aren't used by just one user almost ever. So that's the correct way to license those. There's probably others I'm not thinking of off the top of my head, but really Intune and Defender for Endpoint are the big ones. The other one is the aforementioned Microsoft 365 apps for enterprise. It is also possible to do device-based licensing model for those applications. For those same scenarios, we have a kiosk, we have a shared device, and it's not economical to license every user for the M365 apps for enterprise. So instead, we'll license the device itself. And that is also an option. So those are the big three that jump to mind for me: Intune, Defender for Endpoint, M365 apps for enterprise. I'm sure there's others, but those are top of mind and the ones you're most likely to run into.
The break room PC is a great example because it's like you're using internal employees, FTEs, that are going to access it. If you license the users, which you obviously have control over, then you just have to license the user. You do not need to license the device itself because everyone who's going to interact with that, you can install MDE on the device. Everyone who's touching it, who's using it, will already be licensed. Now, I like to use the example of like a library where you have a computer that, you know, people are looking up stuff on that's just general public walking in, not necessarily an employee. And there's just no way that you're going to like say, Adam, who's walking in as a public person, you're going to license that person for MDE, right? So in that case, you still want to protect the device, then you would license the device itself for MDE and you would be covered.
Great example. Or you've got a PC, you've got a Surface Pro sitting at your security desk for people to check in and print off a badge. Again, you're going to do device-based licensing on that because you don't know every user that's going to interact with it, is a great example too. And this concept's going to continue in just a second. So put a pin in that, because this whole concept of if every user is licensed, we can extend that to other scenarios. We're going to revisit in just a moment.
Yeah, because the question continues here on a blog that this listener came across. And Adam and I read through this blog, and basically we've come to the same conclusion, which is this blog is just inaccurate. The information in it is inaccurate. So it really talks about shared mailboxes. So there's this concept of shared mailboxes. And really, there's actually two different ways you can quote unquote share a mailbox. So the correct way is converting a mailbox to a shared mailbox, then assigning users to that mailbox, and then it'll just appear. There's actually no user like name and password associated with it. There's an email associated with it, but no like login associated with it. It just becomes a shared mailbox within your office environment, and then you assign users to it, and then it just appears as another mailbox in their Outlook. Now, the incorrect way to do it is if you create a user, like an actual user, like, you know, shared security at, you know, Microsoft.com or something like that, and then that assign it a license, like an exchange license, to create the mailbox for that, and then you provide the username and password to people to like log into that mailbox, and that would be incorrect. It's also kind of the same concept of like service accounts, like user accounts that are quote unquote service accounts versus like a GMSA or a service principal, kind of in that sense. But shared mailboxes, the question in this blog that it tried to answer is like, do you need an MDO, a Defender for Office license for that shared mailbox? Because it benefits from Defender for Office, that secure email gateway. Do you need a license for the shared mailbox? Because you might have hundreds, thousands of shared mailboxes in your environment that would then add on additional cost if you had to license each one of those. So the short answer is no. Without getting into too much, you don't need to license a shared mailbox. Essentially, in the same vein that we just talked about, any user that is assigned to that shared mailbox, because we can't really exclude the shared mailbox from MDO. Like MDO is a tenant-wide services, and we're going to talk about tenant-wide services in a little bit. But that shared mailbox, if you have a single MDO license, that shared mailbox will essentially inherit those capabilities, regardless of if it's assigned an MDO license or not. And so by that vein, anyone assigned to a shared mailbox must be licensed for MDO. Otherwise, they would technically be out of compliance.
Right. So to any Exchange administrator, what Andy just described is very familiar. Creating shared mailboxes is one of the first things you learn in Exchange Admin Bootcamp. I can say that because I went through Exchange Admin Bootcamp about 10 or 12 years ago now. Shared mailboxes in Office 365 do get a lot of benefits, and you don't have to pay for them because, again, the idea is everyone else accessing this mailbox is licensed. This is just an included benefit with that. It's, again, not a way to like sneak around and secretly give Jane Doe a mailbox without paying for Exchange Online. Look how sneaky I am. That's not the intent. The intent is a bunch of licensed users are going to share this mailbox for some purpose, and they already are paying us and already have a license, and we're not going to make them double pay. Now, there are scenarios with shared mailboxes where you do need to add additional licensing. If you want to put a shared mailbox on litigation hold, if you want to extend the storage, if there's various things you want to do to it, then you do need a separate Exchange Online Plan 2 license assigned to the mailbox to get access to those capabilities. But in general, basic core functionality of a shared mailbox is an included benefit with other licensed users. Now, what Andy described is the same concept with Defender for Office. So if I have a group of people and all 5 of them have a Defender for Office license for their personal mailboxes, meaning they're getting the safe links, the safe attachments, the detonation of 0-day threats before they reach the mailbox, detonation of links at time of click, so on and so forth, then their shared mailbox inherits that same capability. It would theoretically be against the licensing principles if you had a bunch of unlicensed users who are not licensed for Defender for Office, and then they all had access to a shared mailbox that did have access to Defender for Office, that was benefiting from it. That would be outside the principles outlined here. So it's the same idea. If all the users have it, the shared mailbox inherits it. I will say, and Andy, you can back me up on this, we have done a ton of enterprise agreement enrollment renewals, and never once have I asked a user, count the number, or a customer, count the number of shared mailboxes you have so we can license Defender for Office for them. The assumption is almost always you're covering your whole enterprise anyways, because why would you not want to secure some mailboxes? And then your shared mailboxes just get that as an included benefit because every other user who would potentially access it is already licensed. No, I can say in practice, I have never done a deal where we've gone through and counted shared mailboxes to add additional license counts to Defender for Office. That's not a thing. That's not necessary. But let's say you only cover your information workers, your office workers, people who sit at a desk, and then you have a bunch of frontline workers, people who are actually out in the field doing a job of some kind, and they don't sit at a desk all day. And then for those frontline workers, you gave them all access to a shared mailbox that was benefiting from the MDO, the Defender for Office protections. That would theoretically be against the spirit of the licensing there. And you'd probably need to make amends on that. License that shared mailbox at a minimum if you didn't want to license all those user mailboxes. But that would be a pretty unusual scenario, and I haven't run into that in the real world. So sure, you can paint yourself in a corner with goofy licensing scenarios just like anything. But in reality, generally speaking, customers try to do the right thing. Everyone's trying to do the right thing, and we don't run into those situations. I don't run into customers who are trying to like skirt or paint outside the lines on licensing. It's just not something people mess with. Their intent is always do the right thing. And so it's just not a problem.
Moving on to next, because I think that really segues really well to our next kind of topic, which is we have encountered organizations that have chosen to kind of mix E3 licensing with E5 licensing. You can substitute the E with A or G as well. So there may be like some reason where they've profiled certain users to only be an E3 license versus an E5 license. And now when you do that, and I will say up front, the guidance from Microsoft is you should have the same licensing across the board. So in general, like if you're going to go with E5, just license everybody for E5. Now I understand that budget and other things will play into that. But when you do a mix of E3 and E5, that gets into some complications of what we call like tenant wide services, tenant level services. We've mentioned some already, like MDO. So for example, when you have at least one license of MDO or one license of E5, then it will light up the MDO capabilities of safe links, safe attachments. Now you can scope that. You can scope those specific features to a group of users that are licensed for it. You can create policy for that target specific users, and you should do that. Another good example is Entra. Entra P2, if you have E5, gets lit up for everyone, including identity protection. If you start scoping risk-based conditional access, excluding certain people, because if you exclude a group, I had a customer do this one time where they said, we have a risk-based conditional access policy where we're going to include everyone who's licensed for it, and then we're going to exclude them, the ones that aren't licensed for it. Well, if you exclude unlicensed people, they're technically part of the risk-based conditional access policy. And so those people would have to be licensed as well. And other things don't make sense to kind of just have a mixed environment. Defender for Identity is a really good example. Adam and I had a wonderful customer one time where they wanted to license only part of their organization for Defender for Identity.
This is a throwback, Andy. Wow.
You remember that one?
I do. Yes. Yes, I do.
So now, when this came across our desk, it was like, well, technically you could do it, but the way that you would technically segment out users for Defender for Identity, because the way Defender for Identity is deployed is there's an agent that's put on a domain controller, which then monitors every single authentication through that domain controller. So in order to segment, you would have to then segment those authentications to another domain controller that is not tied, and only the users who are unlicensed would go through that domain controller. And if you're familiar with Active Directory architecture, that's just not something that you do. You wouldn't have a single DC that just sits and doesn't communicate with anything else, and a set of users that only authenticate through that DC. Like, I don't think of ever encountered any company that does it that way. So MDI is kind of one of those things that's like an all or nothing. You either license everyone or you don't license it at all. So that kind of like, and there are ways to segment out, like you can, for MDE, like is another good example. We do have ways of like using device groups to limit the E3 capabilities versus E5 capabilities, but it's on the company to make sure that you are in compliance, and there are a lot of nuances to it. So in general, I would say the guidance is to license everyone, but I don't know if you have any other examples that you've encountered, Adam, of mixed licensing kind of stories, but those are kind of the ones that I have usually encountered.
The guidance is not to mix, at least at a persona level. So all my information workers are the same. licensing level. My frontline workers are at the same level. And the reason why is administrative overhead, which Andy just walked through. He just walked through, you need to go through all these different tools and you need to create segmentation for all of them and be aware of where the licensing line is. So you have just made a ton of administrative overhead for your people in order to segment this out and effectively not protect some users as well, which is always weird to me. But sometimes these decisions are made above our pay grade and we get handed the situation and we make the most of it. And we understand that. So in general, across the board, most E5 security and compliance capabilities do not perform technical licensing enforcement. And a part of the reason why is we don't want to be in a scenario where something got turned off over some sort of licensing snafu and your organization was not protected, had a security incident, became non-compliant with regulations or other compliance factors, and then it becomes a huge problem. So we would much rather solve that on the back end later. Just like I described in the old days, when you could basically install whatever you wanted, do Exchange Server, do your SQL Server, and then just true it up at the time of your anniversary. It works kind of in that way where the onus is on the customer to be compliant with the licensing. The software will not enforce that and force you to be compliant. So you need to take those steps to make sure if you do have a segmented user base that's on different licensing in each tool to ensure that users are only benefiting from what they're licensed for. And there are a couple of scenarios even where that's not possible, where Microsoft's tooling does not allow it. So Andy mentioned Defender for Identity has no way to segment it. It's either deployed to everyone or it's not. So in general, we won't allow you to license it for half your user base because we'll say, well, can you guarantee that only this set of users is going to hit this domain controller? And as Andy mentioned, if you know anything about Windows, Windows will talk to any domain controller it can talk to. It will pick randomly any domain that's available. You can't tell Windows clients only talk to this domain unless you've achieved that through network segmentation. So what we told the customers, sure, that's theoretically possible if you can guarantee that these clients don't hit that domain controller, which is very difficult. But there's other scenarios. Andy mentioned Entra ID protection. You get all these extra logs, these much more detailed risk events, sign-in risk events, user risk events. You will get those for every user and you cannot scope them. There's no way to say, don't show me those alerts for these users. So in general, my guidance is pretend you didn't see that for anyone that's not licensed. And if you do benefit from it, that's fine because we don't give you a way to not benefit from it. But it probably is not a great move to then go open a support ticket about it. Hey, my light user that's not licensed for this got this alert. What does this mean? You didn't see it in that case, right? Because you weren't supposed to be getting those anyway, but we don't provide you the tools to segment it. So it's one of those kind of gray areas. But in general, for anything else where there is a tool to turn it off, you do need to. And so that's the bottom line is this creates significant administrative overhead, which is something I have noticed procurement departments don't always do a good job of factoring in because that's seen as a sunk cost. Well, we already have to pay Andy every year or every month, and he likes to get a paycheck every month. So we're going to spend it regardless of what he spends his time doing. But that is scenarios where you've created a significant additional work for your administrators just to keep this stuff straight, which is why even if there is a cost uplift to move more users to, say, a different license, there can be benefits of lighter administrative overhead when I know every user, frontline worker, information worker, everyone has the same license level effectively. I can just turn on everything for everyone and I don't have to manage and babysit all of this work. So there's trade-offs to both, of course. There's cost versus effort. And that's why our guidance is generally at least per persona keep that licensing consistent because you do run into all these challenges with that approach when you have mixed licensing.
Okay, so the final thing that I wanted to touch on is Azure and how does Azure billing work?
Mm-hmm.
So there's no license that you buy for Azure, and we could have just wrapped it up in like 30 seconds, said you just pay for what you use in Azure. Thank you. Have a great day. But there is an Azure calculator, so a cost calculator that you can go to that's public. And that takes into account a lot of different things. So if you go to the Azure calculator, let's say you put in something like Defender for Cloud. You can type in the number of servers that you have, like number of containers, and it'll pop out a cost for you. And that cost does factor in like the what do you call it, like the list price, right? So it looks at the list price of what it costs, and then it kind of gives you that. Now if you do like something like Sentinel will have different ingest tiers. So like the more you ingest, the less you pay, and that's just kind of built in. You can do a commitment tier and look at it, and that calculator will spit out a cost, kind of assume that you're on a commitment tier, and then it'll do a discount for you. But that can give you kind of a good, this word that I learned from Adam, a budgetary estimate. Kind of the most that you would pay for it at list price. But there are avenues to decrease that cost. And Adam, if I can point to you, we have several ways to discount Azure off of the list price. One of them is a MAC, and I forget what that stands for, but I know you do. You know what it stands for. So if we want to talk about how, if you're just looking to buy a big, huge chunk, you're like, yeah, I'm going to go all in with Azure, moving all my infrastructure there. It's going to be a lot of money. How do I kind of look at discounting that off of the list price?
Sure. So you mentioned MAC, which is MACC, two C's. It is the Microsoft Azure Commitment to Consume. And that is negotiated with your Microsoft account team based on what you predict you might spend in Azure over the next 1, 2, 3, many years. And based on that commitment, you can achieve kind of an across the board discount on all your Azure services, depending on the level of commitment you're willing to make. And so that's something you can talk to your Microsoft account team about. So again, the greater the commitment, the greater the discount effectively. And generally what we're looking to see is how are you going to grow and do more in Azure? Because making a commitment of saying, well, we spent $1 million last year, so let's do a $3 million commitment for the next 3 years, like that doesn't have any growth. And so we're looking to see how are you going to grow your Azure business? What else are you going to move to Azure, take from your on-premises data centers? So it's something you'll talk to your account team about, but that's kind of what they're looking for is greater commitment, greater growth in the Azure platform. And that can be on everything, not just security workloads, although security workloads can benefit from a MAC, but everything in Azure. So Azure OpenAI service, virtual machines, Azure storage. Obviously, there's so many capabilities in Azure, I can't even possibly begin to name them all, but they all can benefit from it depending on how you do it. The other thing you can do, and this is true for both Sentinel as well as, we haven't talked about Defender for Cloud yet, but I'll plug this now. There's something called a pre-purchase plan or a pre-purchase program. We call it P3 because it's 3 Ps. And these are effectively ways to prepay for what you may spend in Sentinel or Azure. So Defender for Cloud. Andy mentioned generally in Azure, you pay as you go. You get a bill for here's what you consumed last month. But if you're willing to make an upfront payment instead, it's kind of like when you go to Costco and you know how they'll sell you $100 worth of gift cards to your favorite restaurant for $90. It's kind of like that. It's that same idea of you're effectively, I'm going to go buy Sentinel gift cards and I can buy $100 worth of gift cards for $80. And depending on how much gift cards I buy ahead of time, I can save more. It's kind of a crude analogy, but you get the idea of how that works. It's that same idea of pay up front, save later on what you actually spend with it. So that's another way you can get better pricing in Sentinel and Defender for Cloud, as well as the pre-purchase program or P3. So another opportunity to look into as well for that. And then Andy, you mentioned this, and I feel like I should call it out because we discussed this on 2 shows ago. Microsoft's been in the news a lot recently about changing the volume licensing model for online services to where the waterfall discounts of level A, B, C, and D were going away. And we broke that story on this show several weeks ago now when it was first coming out. And it's worth mentioning, Azure has not had those in a decade or more, has not had waterfall pricing. There hasn't been a different level discount just built in programmatically for volume licensing. But as I've mentioned, you can negotiate Azure MAC, a discount based on, hey, the more you are committing to spend, the more you can save. There's pre-purchase programs for Defender for Cloud and Sentinel. And then you can also negotiate pricing with your Microsoft account team just on a specific service. So if you need pricing to be in a certain range for a specific product like a Defender for servers, you can certainly talk to your Microsoft account team about that. And they do have some room to negotiate on the pricing there as well. So You made a good call out. The pricing calculator is great for getting budgetary pricing. The other call out I want to mention on the Azure pricing calculator as well is you do pick an Azure region when you're doing the calculator, and different regions can have different pricing models because it costs more to run data centers in different parts of the world, even different parts of the United States. And so that variable pricing can be baked into some of these products. Some of them are priced differently per region, some of them are not. So, for example, Defender for Server is pretty consistent across all regions. In fact, I don't think there's differences, at least within the same country. Whereas Sentinel is priced differently in almost every United States region, I know, as an example, and your pricing can vary a little bit depending on what region you want to run it in. So make sure you're also choosing the correct region as you're looking at the pricing calculator, and be aware that some services are regionalized in terms of their cost structure.
Yeah. So just to kind of hammer on this one point, the MAC is an agreement that for like your total Azure spend, that's on everything, every single service that's offered in Azure. So most likely, if you're in a security shop, you're going to want to like work with your infrastructure engineers, your business desk, your procurement, and like figure out how much you think as a whole, because actually the security spend on Azure infrastructure is only a very small portion of it, anywhere from like 3 to maybe like 12%, right? It's about as high as I've ever seen for security spend. And that's like, Azure Firewall, Azure WAF, Defender for Cloud, Azure DDoS, Sentinel. So the big ones in general, and I'll highlight some of these big ones, is usually we look at Defender for Servers. There's a P1 and P2. And don't shoot the messenger, but I want to make sure that our listeners understand MDE. When we talk about MDE, that is usually referred to users or like user devices. And there's a P1 for MDE, which is included in E, and that is just kind of the AV kind of static rule portion of it. Then when you talk about that advanced EDR and all those features that would typically compete with like a CrowdStrike, that's MDE P2. Now, when you forward it over to servers,
For those of you who are listening and not watching, I am cringing and squishing my face in disgust at what Andy's about to say.
yeah. So Defender for Servers P1 is equivalent in capabilities to MDE P2.
Do you want to say that again? Because it makes no sense.
Yeah. So Defender for Servers P1 is equivalent to MDE, the user licensing, for P2. So the advanced EDR. We don't have like a basic license for servers. Essentially, if you don't want to use the EDR portion for the servers, you're just using the built-in Defender AV agent, and you can manage that through group policy. So if you're going to license for a server, it's the advanced licensing. The CrowdStrike, SentinelOne kind of compete. It's the advanced EDR, and so that's we call that Defender for Servers P1, but it's equivalent to MDE P2. Now there is a Defender for Servers P2, which includes a whole host of things. We actually did a whole show on this. I can certainly link it, or you can look back on our Defender for Servers show, because we went through a whole host of different capabilities. And the price difference is significant. At list price, Defender for Servers P1 is $5 per server, which is equivalent to like if we were to license a device for it in MDE P2 as well. But Defender for Servers P2 is $15 per server, again, at list price. Now, if you have a Mac that is like a 15% discount, you would automatically get 15% discount on that. And then Adam mentioned that you could go to, your Microsoft rep and negotiate on a specific price as well for a service like that. So multiple ways of getting discounts. And I kind of wanted to highlight, we did a whole cloud security and kind of how it's built, but most of this cloud security stuff is actually fairly reasonably priced. The ones that are going to be your big bill is Defender for Servers. Defender CSPM could be as well. I found out today, actually, Adam, I'm almost a little embarrassed to tell you this, but in the official documentation, it looks at billable resources for Defender CSPM, and it's like, I think the list price is $5 per resource. And the billable resources don't include ARC-enabled servers or ARC-enabled, like any hybrid. So it's really only Azure stuff. Whereas like Defender for Servers, you can defend, you can enable on an Arc enabled server. But the CSPM stuff, all the foundational stuff is still there. Obviously, like it's still protected, but the advanced stuff that you're paying for, the billable stuff, only is for multi-cloud capabilities that are not Arc enabled. So that can be, it's, if you look at it, you may not have as many billable resources as you think. So I think it's still probably a big chunk of your security spend, but it's not going to be as big as like Defender for servers, because that's usually the largest chunk for most people. And then the other two that I wanted to highlight was Defender for storage, which like the base storage stuff is not that expensive, but I have seen people with the malware scanning kind of go a little overboard. If you're, depending on how often you're scanning, how much data that you're scanning, that can get expensive pretty quickly. And then also, I think in your experience, Adam, you've seen Defender for API also can generate a lot of cost as well. So, like, I think those are the big ones that I would highlight as like larger cost versus like Defender for SQL or Defender for ARM or something like that, right?
Yeah, totally fair. I would say those are the heavy hitters too.
And then for Sentinel, like we mentioned, it's based on ingest. The tiers are per day. So let's say it's 500 gigs per day and you're committing to 500 gigs per day. If you exceed that limit per day, you will pay, per gig or whatever it is at a discounted rate in your monthly bill. So the commitment tiers are to a specific amount of ingest per day. And so that's important to remember, because like people will spike in data ingest. And so you kind of want to look at your baseline and know that this is my baseline that I'm going to ingest. And then I may have spikes and I'll pay for the overages based on a discounted cost of my commitment tier. And you can do a calculation of like how much overage I need to actually pay for daily before it's going to bump me where I'm going to save money to commit to the next tier. And usually, I think Adam and I have both done this calculation. It is pretty close. Like it's
you have
like
to be really close to the next tier.
Really close to the next tier daily before you want to bump up in commitment to that tier. So
right.
Typically
like really, really close. Like I think within 1% to 2%. Like if you are, what's a great example? The commitment tiers are 500 gig, and then the next one's a terabyte, right? Like you have to be at 980 gig per day or something like that before the terabyte one actually makes sense. So the commitment tiers do save you a little bit more money as you step up them, but it's not significant. And I want to make one point. Overage has this connotation that it's a punitive rate. Overages are not punitive with Sentinel commitment tiers. So a commitment tier is a price floor. When you make a commitment tier, and you're only committed to it for 31 days, by the way, you can change it you can go up at any time. You can go down every 31 days. It is a price floor. You will pay a minimum of this much per day. And let's say it's 500 gigs and the cost is X. That same rate that takes you to that 500 gig mark, each gig after that, 501, 502, are charged at that same rate. So it's not a punitive rate. It's the same rate you got up to the commitment tier, just keeps going. So it's not like, oh, well, I want to make sure I never go over. Like if you remember, you used to go over your minutes on your cell phone plan if you're really old school, and it was very punitive to go over your minutes. It's not like that at all. You actually want to do the opposite. You want to make sure that you're going to talk over that amount of minutes every month, to use that kind of analogy and stretch it there to Sentinel. But when you make a commitment tier, you want to make sure you're consistently hitting that commitment tier. Otherwise, you're better off at the one below it.
Yep. Exactly. Yeah, I think a lot of us have that kind of scar tissue, especially like in our age bracket.
Exactly, right?
Where we are thinking like, oh my God, I don't want to go over. But it's actually good to go probably over a little bit each day, because then because if you don't go over, you're still committed to that tier.
You're still paying it either way.
Yeah. If I'm in the 10 terabyte per day tier and I'm only using 9 terabytes each day, I'm still paying for 10 terabytes each day.
Right.
But
and so the pricing calculator, as Andy mentioned, automatically shows you the best commitment tier for what you're asking. But just know, in production, in the Sentinel environment, it will not automatically opt you into a commitment tier. That requires human intervention to do. You will be on the absolute just pay as you go rate until you opt into a commitment tier. So the pricing calculator just shows you automatically as you spin the dial, like, oh, if I'm here, what's it cost? If I'm here, what's it cost? But in the real world, it won't put you there until you say to put it there. So just make sure you're aware of that difference. It's showing you the best rate you can obtain by making a commitment but you still have to choose it. And again, commitment also is a dirty word, but is a 31-day commitment to go down, and you can go up at any time. So it's not a long-term commitment by any means. It's 31 days.
Yep. All right. I think I'm going to skip the rest of the stuff that we had listed as notes because I don't think it makes a ton of sense to talk about now. So I think that should be a wrap for a pretty good show on some of the more nuanced deployments that we've seen.
Should we do Security Copilot real quick?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that would fit in here as well. The other ones are kind of more niche that you would took off the rundown, but Security Copilot, just for your awareness, 2 billing models for that. So first, there is provisioned capabilities. So the way Security Copilot is also Azure consumption model, and you can pre-provision capacity for it in what's called a security compute unit, or SCU. You have to have a minimum of 1. Security compute units are billed $4 per hour. If you're good at math, in an average 730-hour month, it's $2,920, $29.20, per month. So about $3,000. I will round there to just that's minimum to get in the door, to have it turned on, to have your data retained in Security Copilot. From there, you could choose to provision more security compute units, again at a cost of about $3,000 per month, or you can use overage security compute units, where they do cost a little bit more in this case, but you only pay for them when you need them. So you can say, hey, you know what? I'm cool with going up to 10 security compute units when there's heavy usage, when my SOC is in there reverse analyzing scripts, or I've got a lot of admins in the Intune portal and the Entra portal and the Purview portal using Security Copilot. Feel free to use up to 10. So you set the maximum you would use of overage security compute units per hour, and overage security compute units are billed at $6 per hour. But again, only as you use them. So if you think of Security Copilot, $3,000 to get in the door. So 36, not a lot for most any enterprise. I mean, that's money they find in the couch cushions. But then you would pay for overage security compute units above and beyond 1, which 1 is enough to do most of the basic admin capabilities, but anything that's really in-depth SOC analysis is probably going to go past that and start burning some overage security compute units. Now, also, we have these new agentic capabilities in there, and they can really vary in terms of usage and your environment and your load. And that's why this model really requires you to kind of kick the tires on this and see what your organization is going to need, because it can be so variable depending on the complexity of your queries and your prompts and how you as an organization want to use it. But that's the basic idea there on Security Copilot, is built as part of your Azure consumption as well. And then one final note I want to circle back to, because I thought of it in my mind. We were talking about all this Defender for Server stuff and this consumptive model. Andy mentioned $5 per server per month for Plan 1, $15 per server per month for Plan 2. And he may have mentioned you can also use this for on-premises workloads, as well as workloads in other clouds, AWS and GCP. Just to be clear, that all still bills back to Azure. Even if the server is on premises, it still bills through your Azure consumption. And that sounds weird, but it's actually really quite simple. The agent just reports and says, hey, I've been running for 3 hours, bill this customer for 3 hours. And away you go. Because although we're quoting per month costs, because that's how most people think about it, Defender for Server Plan 1 and Plan 2 are actually billed hourly. And so the benefit of them is if you decommission a server, if a server is offline for maintenance in certain windows, you don't pay for it during those hours where it's offline, or from the moment it's been decommissioned, the very next hour billing stops. So it's a very granular billing model where you're only being billed for exactly what you're using, which is really beneficial as well.
Yeah. And just like we talked about before, if you were to buy Defender for Endpoint for servers, like the server-based licensing versus this consumption model, you have to estimate. If I have 3,000 servers, I buy, the $5 times 3,000, and that's what I'm going to pay, per month. But if I have, 3,100 servers, I grow, you're going to have to true up at anniversary or whatever. And you're committed to that number, that 3,000 number
for the year.
Right. So if, like, let's say you find you decommissioned a call center or something like that, and there's a bunch of servers that was running, and you take 500 off of that. Now you're at 2,500. You're still paying the 3,000 on your agreement for that year until you can true up, and you're not going to get like money back, right? If like halfway through the year,
You can drop them at your next anniversary, sure, but yeah, in the interim, nothing is going to change.
right? Which is where like this Defender for Servers consumption model has an advantage, where because it's tracked, there's a meter that's kind of spinning, so to speak, in Azure. As soon as you decommission it and it's no longer reporting in on Defender for Servers, you're no longer paying for it as part of that protection.
Within the hour.
Within the
Which
hour.
is really great compared to, do you want a granularity of 1 year or granularity of 1 hour? I mean, to me, that's not a hard choice, but.
And we're dropping all of these like values, right? Like Adam, you mentioned $3,000 per month for Security Copilot. We mentioned the 5 and 15 for Defender for Servers. All of that can be discounted like with a Mac, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And you can also negotiate specific prices with your account team for those services as well. So
yep. And it's either or, by the way, you can't stack both. So you could either take the Mac level discount across the board, or if you negotiate a price on a particular Azure service or product, that supersedes then any Mac discount, just for a point of clarification.
That's good to know. I mean, this is stuff that you deal with all the time. So I didn't know that it was like, if we already have a 15% discount, can I negotiate a 20% discount on top of that 15? Sounds like
you can,
no.
But then you'd take 20 instead of 15, not 20 plus 15.
Makes sense. Okay. All right. Well, hopefully this was informative. We got a lot of great feedback from our listeners on this licensing, because it can be complicated, which is why we decided to do a 3-part show on this. So might be boring, but it's always good to understand how the licensing works, because Microsoft, like I said, it's something that we have a full-time employee dedicated to.
The commercial executive. Andy, you said, before we go, you learned something today. You were talking about Defender CSPM. I learned something today too. So we record this on the Friday before Labor Day weekend here in the United States. And I was about to email some folks in Canada. And so I got curious, does Canada have Labor Day? Not only does Canada have Labor Day, first off, it's spelled the Canadian way, Labour with a U in it. They celebrate it on the first Monday in September, the same as the United States. So in both the United States and Canada, we'll be celebrating Labor Day on Monday. I did not know. I knew like Canada had Canadian Thanksgiving. I knew it's a different day than the United States. I did not know Canada had Labor Day, and I did not know it was on the same day. So I learned something today too.
All right. Well, that's a wrap for our show today. Thanks for listening and watching as always. Our contact information, along with some links to the licensing conversation that we had to talk about, will be in the show notes. If you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future, they might make the show. So just reach out, email us, LinkedIn, email, whatever it is. So thanks for listening and watching, and we'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.